So welcome everyone. I am Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. And it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this conference called Rethinking Nature and Society in Latin America, which is co-organized by the Institute of Latin American Studies, the Global Centers of Columbia in Rio de Janeiro and Santiago, and the IRE. This has been organized by Ben Orlov, Gustavo Acenia, and myself. And we really want to thank you for participating. If you're watching through YouTube, you can ask the questions that you're interested using the comment function, and the Monica will write them in the chat, and the chair will take the questions. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Monica Trigos, who has made this technically possible and organize all aspects of the conference. All the errors, of course, remain Ben and Gustavo's and me and mine. So welcome everyone. I want to pass the word to Ben, who will be the chair of the first panel.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. It's so exciting to be here at the start. Our first of the panels of this 5-week session of panels is called Transforming Natures, and we'll be seeing the variety of forms that takes. We have 3 people who are presenting here, all colleagues here at Columbia University in different departments. Maria Uriarte in the Department of Ecology, Environment, and Evolutionary Biology. Then Walter Betson from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, and that's where Miguel Piguelo Vasquez is also based, there at the Earth Institute. So I'll invite Maria to start.
Thank you, Ben. Share my screen. Okay, I need to switch my display. All right, can you see the presentation in the mode
Yes.
that it needs to be? Great. Well, first I'd like to start by just thanking the organizers for putting together this panel, and I'm very glad to be here with Miguel and Walter, a part of Team Peru. We used to work together in a project in Peru, and it's a pleasure to work with them. So the work that I'm going to present today, the heavy lifting was really done by Naomi Schwartz, who was a former graduate student in my lab, now at the University of British Columbia, Michael from the University of Puerto Rico, and Chilo Grau from the Universidad Nacional de Tucumán in Argentina. So one thing that's become clear to pretty much all of us is that achieving the goal of keeping climate warming below 2 degrees Celsius is going to require negative emissions. That means we're going to have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere in some fashion. And in this light, there's been a number of international initiatives, the most prominent being the Bond Challenge, but others also that arise from the Paris Accords, and probably forthcoming ones for the, if you don't know this, we're in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, that are aiming to bring forest restoration as a tool to not only combat climate change, but also preserve biodiversity and improve the livelihoods of rural people. And if you look at Latin America, it actually leads in terms of commitments to the Bond Challenge. And there's been 18 pledges with over 35 million hectares commitment to forest restoration, with Brazil leading the way. And when you think about forest restoration, this can happen in 2 ways. You can, of course, plant trees, but you can also just let nature take its course. And in fact, this is known as natural regeneration. And this is what happens here in the Northeast if you start mowing your lawn. Stuff just starts growing. And this happens also in nature. When people stop farming the land or using it in some way, vegetation recolonizes the area. And this is a very attractive option for achieving negative emissions because it's inexpensive. It has very low environmental risk, and also has additional benefits, for instance, biodiversity conservations that don't come with plantations, and offer livelihood opportunities, particularly for communities that are dependent on forests. And as it turns out, tropical forests in Latin America can do this very well if we just let them grow. So there's a group of us working in various places in Latin America that are indicated here in the black circles that have studied this question. And we have shown that forests in Latin America can go back to achieve 90% of the biomass of an old growth forest on average about 66 years. So when you look at potential at the, with this same group, in 2008, there were about 2.4 million kilometers of land that in 40 years can accumulate carbon that equals carbon sequestration of 31 petagrams of CO2. Just to put this in perspective, for those of you that don't think in CO2 units, this is equivalent to carbon emissions from fossil fuels and industrial processes in all of Latin America and the Caribbean between 1993 and 2014. And the map of the potential sequestration is here in the bottom. It's as you would, there's higher potential in areas that have high precipitation relative to low precipitation. And as usual, there's a few countries that account for 95 of this carbon storage potential, with Brazil leading the way and Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela following. So if you see this kind of information, you may say, well, great, we can just let nature take its course and this will happen. We'll get great carbon sequestration. So there is some cause for optimism. We have seen, substantial forest regrowth in Latin America, but what's unclear is how these short-term trends that are typically calculated in 5 to 10 years play out over longer timescales, which of course is a prerequisite to achieving the carbon sequestration that we want. And we know that these persistent increases in forest cover typically occur in certain places and also when socioeconomic conditions are favorable. And any change, particularly in socioeconomic conditions, can completely change the picture. So for instance, we have shown, Miguel was one of the co-authors also, that in Peru, a study in the Ucayali region in Peru, these regrowing forests have a high probability of being clear within 5 years. A similar study in the Brazilian forests has shown that 50% of Brazilian Amazon has shown that 50% of forests are clear within 8 years. And again, in Costa Rica, these forests tend to be clear in less than 20 years. So how does this play out at a larger scale? So what we wanted to do is, rather than look at two time points, two snapshots of forest, and then calculating regrowth or reforestation between 2 points, we wanted to consider a broader set of possible trajectories of forest change in Latin America between 2001 2014. And to do this, we evaluated essentially 6 possibilities. One, that there's no change, so it's flat. 2, that is decreasing, that's deforestation. 3, that is increasing, that's reforestation, and then reversals, reforestation followed by deforestation, and deforestation followed by reforestation. And then a set of cases where the data doesn't allow us to discern between those different possibilities. And then we wanted to evaluate what are the consequences of areas that started to reforest, but were cleared again in terms of carbon sequestration potential at this large scale. So we did this, and I'll give you just the punchline. So here are the 6 trajectories. You can see the majority of forest, there is no change, right? So the trajectory is flat in all in the Amazon. We have here also in blue the arc of deforestation in the Amazon, but we have areas of deforestation reversal here in the south. This is actually mostly plantations, I should say. And we have reforestation reversals, which is what we're interested in, focused on the Atlantic forest in Brazil, Colombia, and parts of Venezuela. So of all the area that we study, these reversals of reforestation were 10 times as likely as just steady increases in forest cover. And deforestation reversals were also common, although, as I mentioned, we're doing now a more detailed study showing that that is really driven by plantations. So what this means is that in areas, these of the almost 6 million hectares that were being reforested, only 31% of them remained at the end of our study period. In terms of carbon sequestration, what this means is that these forests, without reclearing, would have accumulated 0.58 petagrams of carbon, but only a small proportion of that, 24% of that carbon actually was sequestered. Most of these forests were cleared. And the distribution of where this happened, of course, is not random. The vast majority of reclearing, as I mentioned, is in Colombia, where we saw initial reforestation primarily driven by rural-urban migration and conflict, driven by, well, you all know the wars of narco traffic and so on and the FARC. And then in Venezuela, more recently, with primarily people, food shortages, and political instability. In terms of area, the foregone carbon sequestration potential, because of the just sheer area of forest, is led by Brazil and Colombia, followed by Mexico. So, what these results calls into question are claims that I have also made in the past that global tree restoration is our most effective climate solution today. That's a statement that needs to be, sort of nuanced. What we show in our study is that there's a much more complex and dynamic reality where we have short-term increases of forest reforestation that may not necessarily lead to persistent trends. And in fact, 20% of the area that we examined, we had either deforestation reversals or reforestation reversals that were just as common as persistent loss or persistent gain. And these fitting linear trends to time series data of forest essentially is obscuring often these what are called reforestation treadmills in planted tropical regions where forests are planted and constantly recleared. And just to give you an idea of what this means in terms of national commitments that different countries have made, Colombia, for instance, pledged 1 million hectares in forest restoration to the Bond Challenge, and Brazil 12 million hectares. So our findings represent that there's been substantial foregone carbon sequestration, larger than Colombia's entire commitment and nearly half of Brazil's. So when we think about this from economic and policy barriers to forest regrowth, what is going on? Well, clearly in any kind of commodity production landscape, not cultivating your land, letting the forest regrow, has a very high opportunity cost and requires that landowners receive some kind of compensation to transform the land into persistent forests. But there's also a sort of more insidious issue, which is that these natural regenerated forests are invisible from a policy perspective for a number of reasons. First, they're often only conceived via tree planting. Often farmers think of these regrowing forests as, in fact, there's words like in campo sujo in Portuguese, but also, I've seen this in where I work a lot in Puerto Rico, that this is messy, that this represents poor land management. There's also no business models or economic incentives to work with natural regeneration. And because natural regeneration does not require human agency or is viewed as not require human agency, they cannot be considered as policy. And perhaps most damaging is the fact that in some countries, agrarian reform laws obligate farmers to cultivate land. And if this land is not cultivated, state authorities can confiscate the land. And this is, part of agrarian reform in many countries in Latin America. So what this means is that we have, ongoing forest laws. So these are figures that are more recent, going to 2020, where we have in Latin America forest laws primarily driven by commodity production. And this is accelerating in part, because of the political situation in Brazil, but it's not only Brazil that contributes to this issue. So what policies can we put in place to foster regeneration? Well, one thing that seems obvious but does not exist is to create appropriate land type definitions to be able to say something about these regrowing forests and to preserve them. And we need to identify what areas are best suited from a biophysical perspective and from an economic perspective and social perspective to allow the forest to regrowth. And also leverage, the upcoming decade of restoration to gain political momentum to enhance the value of these forests. At the national scale, there's clear contradictions between the management of natural resources and the policies that are used for this. I'm almost done, Ben. I'd be a minute. And food production. We need maps and we need programs that allow farmers to manage these systems in an effective way. And finally, we need business models that account for this type of forest and their potential. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Maria. It's a fascinating presentation, and it's really important to get this scope across the whole region to see common patterns and differences between countries. I think that's something that will be unfolding throughout this whole session. I don't see it in the chat. I'm not seeing any specific questions, kind of points of information. So I think this would be a good moment to move on to Walter Betson.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's a great idea to have an event like this, especially when we are quite isolated and with very little interaction. My presentation is going to be different from the one that you just saw from Maria. My presentation is more general, and the main objective of this presentation is hopefully to trigger some discussions in the next 40 or 50 minutes. I'm going to use in rethinking what the agriculture and the foodscape for Latin America. I'm going to use a lot of data from a very recently published report from the World Bank that I strongly recommend that you read. Very well written, very comprehensive, good data. And I have 10 minutes, and so it's very difficult to try to cover everything that I would like to cover. But these are some of the key drivers of Latin American agricultural systems and the food systems. I will very briefly touch some of those drivers. Again, I hope we have time to discuss more after the presentation. Now, the first issue regarding food systems. Latin America is one of the food baskets of the world. The share of the region in the global production of some of the commodities is huge. Cases like, well, avocado, but also coffee, soybean, sugarcane. And as a region, there's a very important share of the total global production. But also, if you look at some individual countries, it's amazing that the share of the global production in some of our countries. Coffee in Colombia, soybean, Brazil, beef in a small country like Uruguay. So one, Latin America is a key food world basket. Two, Latin America is the world's largest net food exporter. If you look at the evolution here in Latin America, is in yellow. If you look at the evolution of the last 30 years, clearly the region has been a very important net exporter. But in the last 10 years, that participation has been even bigger. If you compare what happened, for example, with the Middle East and Northern Africa, Latin America is clear not only a main food producer for the world, but also a net exporter. Now, we all know Latin America is a land of contrasts. So on the one hand, we are a region with the largest exporter, but at the same time, there is an acceptable level of undernourishment in the region, with some cases that are really very big, but also with many cases that are around 15 or 20%. So largest food exporter, but very important prevalence of undernourishment. And this, of course, is related to poverty levels. In the last 20 years, there has been a significant poverty reduction. Here I am showing the prevalence, the rate of poverty in rural and urban areas, and clearly most of the poor are rural. And although this situation has been improving, still the amount of poverty in the rural areas is very, very big. In addition to that, and related to changes in income, changes in culture, changes in working force, there is a relatively new public health challenge related to the amazingly high prevalence of overweight and obese people in the region. Have countries like with relatively good income, like Argentina, Chile, with very, very high percent of people with overweight or obese. And this, of course, is creating these new public health challenges related to non-communicable diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure. So Latin America as a food basket and as a food exporter, when we think of that, immediately comes to our mind, these are the large farms, the commercial corporations in Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. However, more than 50% of the food production in Latin America comes from family farms. If you look at the area, the total area of agricultural land, more than half of the total land is devoted to family farmers. So this is a key issue, a key component of the food system in Latin America. Now, Latin America is one of the few areas in the world where we still have some land that can be converted to agriculture. If that is what is going to happen, it's imperative that that conversion is done in a sustainable way. However, the reality is that the cost of converting new land to agriculture is very high. And so the needed improvements in the amount of food produced in the region will have to come from increases, mainly from increases in productivity. Another critical issue of the region is a large reserve of the world's natural resources. Latin America occupies more or less 12–14% of the total global area, but it contains 50% of forests, more than 30% of plant, mammal, precipitation, renewable water. So this is a richness in Latin America that we have to be very, very careful to consider when thinking of development paths. One case that I think is interesting and normally not very well thought is the case of water. Latin America has, proportionally 3 times more water than land compared to the rest of the world. And it contains, this graph is showing the discharge of some of the largest rivers in the world. And the largest discharge comes from the Amazon. But here you see one that is even higher discharge than the Amazon River. It's called the Amazon Flying Rivers, which is the evapotranspiration originated in the Amazonian forest. And that evapotranspiration generates huge amounts of moisture that then is transported via the winds to other parts of Brazil, South Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, northern Argentina, and it's a very important part of the total precipitation in the region. So protecting a natural ecosystem like the Amazon is not only important for that ecosystem, but because of the direct impact that it has on other regions, in this case of Latin America. So what are the challenges for food production in our region? Being a food basket for the world, we have to play a very important role in helping to feed the more than 9 billion people expected by 2050 or 2060. Now, because of costs and because of regulations and because of other situations, most of this increased contribution to feed the world will not come from agricultural land expansion. It will come from intensification, increasing productivity. And that intensification has to be achieved using sustainable practices. Now, in the past, most of the intensification efforts were linked to increased and often excessive use of input use and the consequent deterioration of natural resources. Now, when rethinking our agricultural systems, our food systems, it's imperative to adopt agroecological, sustainable management practices. And this is not important just because of the responsibility to contribute to this global threat. There's also commercial opportunities for the food production systems of Latin America. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is in crop production. What we are finding, this is in a work that we very recently published, we're finding that there is a way to produce crops, agricultural crops like soybeans, wheat, corn, and sequester carbon by just introducing pastures in the sequence. So we have, this was based on a very, very good long-term experiment in Uruguay where we calibrated a corn carbon model. And what we are finding is that in a degraded soil, by introducing pastures rotating with the crops, we can have net gains of carbon sequestration. And even in well-managed soils, by including about 50% of the time with pastures, that also results in net carbon sequestration. So there are ways to increase crop production and at the same time sequester or maintain carbon in the soil. Even in livestock, which is normally associated with the most contaminating activity in agriculture, we are finding opportunities to produce livestock in sustainable ways. And there are very interesting activities going on now, for example, in Colombia, a project that is being funded by the British and by the GEF, where they are combining livestock production with trees, with silvopastoral techniques, with family farms. They're increasing productivity and they're resulting in net carbon gains. In the case of Uruguay, where the livestock is produced in natural rangelands, this is not areas that were cleared to have cattle, but this is natural rangelands, have always been natural rangelands. There are also activities that are showing that it's possible to produce beef in sustainable ways. Most of these efforts, as expected, are focused in family farms. And the nice thing is that these efforts go all the way to the commercial part of the system. So now in Colombia or in Uruguay, they're trying to find market niches that are willing to pay maybe a bit more when the beef is produced in sustainable ways, when it's sequestering carbon. So these type of efforts are not only, as I was saying before, not only a contribution to the responsibility to maintain, to have a sustainable development, but also is resulting in commercial opportunities for the farmers. Regarding policies, what are some of the things that I believe that we need to focus with respect to food production system? One is transition to what's called the decoupled payments. The typical payments in the past were subsidies that were proportional to the amount of product that a farmer was producing, and that results in big distortions. Sometimes farmers were producing products that were not resulting in economic loss, but the subsidies allow them to do it anyway. The decoupled payments are much more effective, they're much less distorting of the markets. They have measured multiplier effects on other sectors of the society. There are good examples in Mexico. And they can be used to promote good practices. So these decoupled payments can be assigned to farmers that are using good practices like I was showing in the crop production or in the livestock production. Another very important thing that we need in the region is increased investments in public goods, typically education for sure, but also research. If we compare the situation of the region now of how much the region is investing in research and development compared to the US, Latin America is about half of what US is investing. And that's also lower than what is happening in East Asia and the Pacific and in Southern Asia. Now, as typical of Latin America, the situation within the region is very variable, very heterogeneous.
I'll just say, Walter, fascinating material, very important to get the policy, but we're a bit over time, so I'd hope.
I'm sorry, I have, okay, 1 minute. So if you look, there's a very disparity in the amount of investment in different regions of Latin America. The third important policy action has to be in promoting what we call climate smart agriculture for improving adaptation, but also reducing net emissions of greenhouse gases. And finally, very important for the region is trade promotions. And for this, and for improving the poverty situation in the rural areas, integrating family farms to market has to be a priority. So, final comments. Latin America is and will continue to be one of the world food baskets and will be still one of the main net food exporters. The consequences of increased income in the last couple of decades, changes in preferences and environmental concerns are resulting in the need to sustainably increase productivity. And this is creating, as I was showing to you, opportunities for farmers. The policy will need to transition to more decoupled payments, increase investments in public goods, mainly research, education, and infrastructure, and promote trade and focusing especially in trying to integrate family farms to the markets. Sorry for the overtime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, these are fascinating questions and very important to hear the concrete possibilities. And I think we're going to be moving to some very interesting discussions with the first on forests and the second on farms. And expanding both of those seems very difficult. So where are the compatibilities? Where are the tensions? We're certainly, there's just these relations through land use, different types of land use, and promoting benefits, promoting engagement, the sorts of policies. But let's move on to Miguel Pinedo, and we'll be hearing about yet another aspect of the forms of nature, in this case, cities and fishing in the Amazon. Miguel, the floor is yours. Miguel, desmúdate.
I'm desmudado. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm in the public space here in the hospital.
Oh gosh.
Well, Gustavo, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And it will be great to have another event in person with Walter and Maria. We haven't been exploring our own limitations, what we know, what we don't know. What I'm going to talk today is to bring the cities into the context of change in Amazonian fisheries. As you probably know, Amazonia is an urban place. I wanted to show how, I want to bring the Ucayali River, where fisheries is more not the basket or the food basket of the world, but I will say is the fish basket of Amazonians or the Peruvian Amazonians. Ucayali is a place, a river where I learned how to fish when I was a kid. It's a place where I was born. It's a place where I start fighting with dolphins. So let me bring this place. And also I want to present data, empirical data, in a large project that I'm being involved with my colleagues from the Instituto Peruano de Investigación de la Amazonía Peruana, IAP. I will There are many ways to see the interlinks between the urban, the cities, and fisheries. Also, there are many ways to see changes. I just wanted to, next one, please, Gustavo. I just wanted to show you some of the basic drivers of change, urban expansion, which I wanted to talk today. We see how now fisheries is more a source of employment and household income to urban residents. Rurality, fisheries is not anymore the main source of protein for rural people or Amazonians in general. Is more income, is employment. Climate change, to see how climate change affects the fishery, it's what we can see not in the big floods, big droughts, but in the seasonal floods, what we call repiquetes, that continuously disturb fish migrations in the Amazon. The other one is high input agriculture. Pesticides and fertilizers have increased sediment and water pollution and the contamination of water. There's not anymore this idea that mining is the main source. Pesticides now are bought everywhere. In my village, when I was born, was not pesticide. Now we have five. Now we have five stores selling fertilizers and pesticides. It's in a village that's less than 1,000 people. Forest conversion to agriculture is also another important issue. Sorry that I had to speak a bit quiet. And deforestation, as Maria said, it's an issue, but in case of fishery, riparian deforestation is a main problem. It's affecting the fragmentation. Let me show you, let me focus in the urban expansion. Next one, Gustavo. As I said, fisheries have become more a source of employment and household income for urbans. Urban demand for fish caught in lakes and rivers is higher than fish that are farmed. This is a new find that we found in the research. Decisions to regulate access and fishing rights in lakes and rivers are increasingly made by urban rather than rural residents. So let me show some data that in what we are making these statements. Gustavo. As you can see here, the average monthly number of urban and rural fisheries who fish in 12 lakes, data that we have from IAP, from 2000 to 2020, you see an enormous increase. In 2000 was almost the same number of rural people, community people and urban people fishing in the lakes. In 2020 is for every one fisherman from the village, there were 5 fishermen from the cities. Next one. In terms of household income, you see how the fishery sales for these 75 families from 2000 to 2020, it's 44%, it's almost half of the household income for these urban families. Next one. For the rural families, for another 75 families, fish sales is only 11%. It's not an important source of income for these rural families. And so you can see the differences between rural and urban. Next one. In terms of preference, fish preference, what people are buying, natural fish is has much more preference in the market, despite that the main effort, development efforts and conservation efforts, it's focused in developing aquaculture in the Amazon. You could see gamitana, the tambaqui in Portuguese, and it's enormous difference in prices. You can now buy in the market Iquitos for almost $7 kilo of gamitana, fresh gamitana, while for the one that are produced in aquaculture is less than $2. Next one. The same thing with paiche or pirarucu has the same relation. Paiche, again, you can see, you could go type paiche in the internet, you're going to have so many aquaculture, so many people cultivating paiche in Loreto, in Iquitos, and you can see the difference. Again, very expensive, almost $7 per kilo, the fish, the paiche that's caught in the rivers and lakes, and less than $2, the one that are produced. Next one, pros. Okay, in terms of urban influence and decision making, this is the data that we have from 120 of the 163 members of 34 fisheries associations are urban fisheries. These are legally recognized associations. These are associations that conservation NGOs love to work with. Majority of them, the members are urban residents. The same thing, 27 leaders of 34 fishing associations are urban fisheries. Leaders are mainly from the urban, living in cities, not living in the communities. Next one. Anyway, this is a just very short presentation to think about how we can, how difficult represents for Amazonians, policymakers, to engage in what is sustainable development goals. You want to do sustainability of fisheries in the Amazon, look at the cities, look at what people are doing, follow the fish, listen to the fisheries. Thank you.
Thanks, Miguel and Maria and Walter. It would be, I'll open with one comment and then I'll look for questions from the audience. I would say that it would actually be difficult to think of a better set of 3 papers to illustrate the problems, because Maria opens with the importance of preserving the forests and yet the difficulties that for the world to address climate change means having trees that absorb carbon, and how challenging it is in the Latin American economic and political context to assure that. And Walter is showing another very important goal, which is achieving food security and understanding the role of Latin America in contributing to world food supplies. And yet we see how competitive those two are for different land uses. And so some of the drivers of deforestation are some of those products for which Latin America is one of the major world producers, beef and soy. And then you see in, so they're really, you have these 2 different forms of land use that go, that are both important and yet in some ways incompatible. And then Miguel shows us how both of those challenge the fisheries, both the deforestation and the intensification of agriculture. We can hope perhaps for a more efficient agriculture that would not pollute so much, but it's hard to fit all of this together. And I think Miguel also brings forward very powerfully the questions of equity, that though there's reference to the income inequality that drives so much political attention, both in Maria and Walter's talk, it's really front and center in Miguel's, where this is the food supply for the poor, the simple jobs for people who otherwise face unemployment, that they too depend on the natural world. So it's quite a question to fit these together, and we see the importance of bringing the different dimensions of resource use together, different forms of resource use, land use, and the importance of equity, the importance of so that's one point. But I will look Monica, any questions coming in the chat? Or I see Vicky.
Yes, these were fantastic presentations. I agree with Ben. I think they were very important. And they also put not just the equity, but the policy question very strongly on the table, right? Because Maria suggests that kind of letting the trees grow naturally, you know, is we're going to see a paper in the next panel that talks about commercial forestry. But the incentives for that, for people who do not have many sources of income, are low. And even for those who have, like, so I think Miguel talked about people who is on, you know, very desperate and might need fishing. But Walter also talks about kind of middle income farmers, if you want, and what are the incentives for them to let the forest grow? I mean, what is the cost that they are willing to put up with? So, and here I think, you know, you point to some things that the government can do that are clearly, so land reform rules were created for another time. I think that's actually a pretty good suggestion to change those in a way that includes conservation as not unproductive use. But it's not so clear to me what other mechanisms can you use at the national level, especially given the, you know, the distributive consequences of something that it's a common good for the world, but the cost is paid by individuals who do not have the most in the world.
I'll go ahead.
No, I can give some comments about that. So, first of all, the way I see it, and maybe it was not clear in my presentation, what I was trying to stress is that the needed increases in food production in Latin America cannot come from expansion, cannot come from invading natural ecosystems. And there is what I was also trying to say is that there is an opportunity to do it without going into expanding the land area. Even when I talk about land area.
Just a quick thing, but you said that required niche markets of consumers that were willing to pay more, right?
Yeah. So, so first of all, also when I was thinking of land expansion, I was not thinking of invading forest. There are a few areas in the llanos in Venezuela, you know, in the Orinoquia, there is a few places in the Cerrados. I was not thinking of forest. Now, with respect to forest conservation, I think that the only option is policy with incentives. You know, if there's no policy and no incentives that are clearly, explicitly oriented to preserve forest, it will not happen. That's the reality. Now, the other thing, and this is also an incentive about the market niches, what I'm thinking is what happens in New York. You know, in New York, if you go to Whole Foods, you know, you're going to be spending more money than if you go to other supermarkets. And the reason why some people decide to buy that is because they are worried about food, you know, safety. They worry about not using hormones. They're not using about, you know, antibiotics in the meat that they consume. And so there are increasing market niches that are willing to pay more. And I'm not thinking of the poor people in Latin America. I'm thinking markets in the developed world that are increasingly willing to pay some more if what they're consuming is environmentally sound. If it has some kind of certification of low carbon footprint or fair trade. And so what I think is that a combination of policies that ensure conservation of natural ecosystems and incentives for good practices and sustainable production systems can result in what we are trying to do, which is increase productivity in a sustainable way.
Yeah, I'd like to follow what Walter said. I mean, I don't really see this. I think we are beyond of the fact that these things are at odds. The question is, how do we achieve these multiple goals in one way? So for instance, in parts of Brazil, they're moving now to this idea of sustainable landscapes, right? Where you have food production, conservation, all at the same time, and you get a certification like they used to do for timber. It's also, I mean, the data that Walter presented, where he said that 50%, or correct me if I'm wrong, Walter, or thereabouts of the food in Latin America is produced by a small scale farmer. These small scale farmers also depend on forest for resources. There was a question in the chat about that, and for timber, for all kinds of things. So how do we create policies that allow both of those things, rather than the expansion of agriculture into new lands, which typically do not necessarily benefit the small farmer. So and then with respect to Miguel, I mean, this is also, forests are also key for rural livelihoods for the most poor communities. So I think that, you know, we can achieve these things. It's just that the policies are not there to value or to link these different components together.
And I would just emphasize, when you think of the policies, it's not only designing the correct policies at the national level that correspond to the international agreements. There's really a question of participation, of co-production. I mean, we've seen that in many of the rural areas, a lot of what we're talking about, there are challenges to governance structures. And so I think there really needs to be the engagement and the buy-in and the flexibility to adapt to these local circumstances. We're talking about the diversity across countries, but many of these countries themselves are also highly diverse with very different local circumstances. So I think, yes, of course, people respond to incentives, and those come from national policies, but it's not just rules that emanate out from capital cities, and there really needs to be a fuller engagement. There was a question in the chat about these forest-friendly products in Brazil, and that's someone who says he's only able to chat, but that there are a number of fruits and nuts that can come from ways to generate income from the forests, and those potentially could offer a number of these co-benefits that we're discussing. And of course, there are the challenges in those would look very different in Brazil under different political, different administrations. Miguel, I'm wondering, do you want any thoughts here? Or?
Okay. I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, just let me follow Monica's comment. It's there is enough resources, financial resources for development and conservation that need to be in the hands of people who are producing, farmers, people who are fishing, people who are reforesting. That money is still not in the hands of them. We have to start thinking about planting papayas. It's not just measured by yellow papayas, have to be measured by also the environmental service that the papaya can produce. That goes along Maria's, that letting forests grow, it's the way to go. The capoeira and the purma in Latin America, but needs to be compensated. To compensate that, there is plenty of resources that resources are not getting to people who are making changes. Let's try to do policies. Let's not to be too, also to think about scaling the way how we start thinking about policies. Walter's statistics of Latin America or the world is interesting, yes, but it will make too much changes if that's not going to geopolitical scale to the companies or farmers who are doing the work. We have to start thinking about more in the ground rather than into this large scale. I'm going to leave now. I have to go to see if my doctor is going to be happy today. Thank you to all of you, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much, Miguel. See you next week.
There's another question on the chat here.
Yes, I see about the sustainable forest practices. From Leticia mentioning that the sustainable forest practices performed by communities in Mexico and Guatemala have supported forests even in second growth forests, and but also raising the question of the position of Latin America within the world, that if Latin America, is it good for Latin America to be a basket for the world exporting food, where you have both questions of undernourishment and then the people who are obese and overweight because they're consuming these industrial foods, many of which are imported. So there's really a question of thinking of the human well-being and the human health and nutrition.
Yeah, and I have a second finger, sorry, Walter, but the largest buyers of food in Latin America are not the niche markets, right? So, I mean, China is the main buyer of soybean in Brazil and in Argentina, and this goes to feed like animals. So I'm wondering how feasible is that strategy? And again, for Maria, if you read, like we're going to discuss Marco's paper next, but the idea that even if you grow forests, there are incentives that the state can sustain them over time when there's so many actors that compete with the state over a territory and have an incentive to cut the forest and get into illegal logging. It seems to me that there, unless Latin America gets helps or incentives from outside the region, it's a pretty hard to sustain strategy. Sorry to.
So let me comment very quick about that. You're right. The main consumers are, now is China. What I was trying to refer to is the opportunities that I was pointing at I was thinking of small farmers. They're good. They're very good cases. For example, in Guatemala, with farmers that used to produce classical corn and beans, and then they were organized to produce Brussels sprouts. And so they were organized with the trading. They mounted their own processing plant, and then the people that were selling this in Europe and the United States, they had a certification that this was coming from small farmers in Guatemala with using low carbon, low footprint. So I think that I think we shouldn't. I try to think in two different ways. One problem is why people are getting obese and overweight. And I don't think it's because of the food that is produced in Latin America. In fact, the food that is produced in Latin America could be a great contributor for healthy diets. I think it is more a problem of changes in the workforces, in culture, in increased income. I don't think that Latin America production is the cause for that. Now, the reason that why I thought it was, I think it's dramatic, the fact that Latin America is the main food exporter and still has this prevalence of undernourishment. And this is a characteristic of our land of contrast in Latin America. And again, I don't think that the solution for that is to stop being a food basket of the world. Latin America will have to do it. There are no other regions that can do that to feed 9 billion people. It has to play a very important role. What I think is a combination of policy, education, and incentives can result in both, in continue being a food basket for the world, using good practices with sustainable production systems, and promoting healthy diets. I'm still optimistic about that, and I think that Latin America is a region that can play an important role.
At this point, I think we've completed our hour, and I'm actually pleased that we're not done. I'm pleased that we have an opening rather than a completion, and I just want to signal how powerfully are coming forward the questions of equity, the questions of policy, the question of the position of Latin America in a changing global order. I'll take 15 seconds to end with an image. There's a large project proposed in the Peruvian Amazon, the Hidrovia Amazonica, which would dredge the rivers in the Amazon. All those rivers that Miguel showed, those would reduce the fisheries, those would open the area for deforestation. And about the only thing it would promote would be oil and gas exploration in the upper Amazon. It's a heavy indebting of Latin America, but these projects are appealing to some people who are capable of approving them. So there are global national policies within a global order that are really poised to create more problems than the solutions we're hoping for. So I'll stop there and just thank everyone for attending, all of you out there in YouTubelandia, and look forward to the next session.
Thank you. Denise Milstein is going to, from the Sociology Department at Columbia, is going to be the chair for the next session, which is called Livelihoods and Access. So Denise, thank you very much. I'll leave it in your hands.
Okay. Hi, Vicky. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for participating, for being here. I think that this conversation is in a way a continuation, or will be a continuation with a slight shift from what all of us were thinking about and talking about over the past hour. So I'm really excited about that. We're going to have 3 panelists. Each one is going to speak for 10 minutes approximately. If you go way over, I might interrupt and remind you of the time constraint. The first is Alicia Cooperman, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M University. And next we will have Gustavo Azeña, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Latin American Studies and Director of the Lehman Center for Brazilian Studies. And then finally, Marcos Mendoza, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Mississippi. So I will turn it over to Alicia. And if you have questions as she's speaking, feel free to include them in the chat or keep them for later, and you can raise your hand and I'll call on you when we have the discussion after the presentations. So Alicia, you have the floor.
You're muted, Alicia. We cannot hear you. Alicia, are you there? Oh, we lost her.
Did we lose her?
I'm here. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute with it screen shared. You would think that I've spent a year doing this, and anyway.
Totally understandable.
I am now unmuted and I will reshare my screen. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm Alicia Cooperman. I know many of you from my time at Columbia. So I did my PhD at Columbia in political science and then spent a year at Princeton as a postdoc before starting here at Texas A&M this past fall. So I'll be presenting today some work on community organizing around water governance and access. So shifting the focus a little bit from the previous presentation to focus more on water insecurity, which is a different type of natural issue with very large social consequences. And my focus is in Northeast Brazil, which is a semi-arid, drought-prone area. So first, I just want to introduce you a bit to the challenge that I encountered while I was doing field work there in 2016 and 2017. So the first is one community that I visited where they relied on water from a local well, but the well had been broken for about 6 months. And so instead they were using donkeys and transporting water with jugs from a neighboring community. And when I asked why this seemed to be the case, people explained, we're not very organized here. It's hard to figure out how to fix the pump on the well. We don't know who to ask. We can't get anyone to help us. And then another community in the same rural municipality in this very poor region of Northeast Brazil, they described to me they have a well. They rely on the water from the well, but the well water in this region is brackish, salobra. And so the government had installed these small desalination treatment plants in this area, but it had been a couple of years since it had been installed. Maintenance had broken down. They didn't know who could help them fix it, and just really struggled with how to maintain the water resources that they did have. And then lastly, again, in the same municipality, this community was totally fine. They had a desalination treatment plant. It worked well. If they needed help with getting anything fixed with their government water resources, they talked to the local city council member. They did all of this via their community association, which was really organized and had a strong relationship with local politicians. And so my research was motivated not by variation at a national level or even at a state level, or even across municipalities, but really why we see variation in water security between communities that are otherwise very similar. And so this question motivates a number of different projects that I have. And today I'll primarily be focusing on the first finding that I have from my research. So when I speak with rural community members in qualitative interviews, as well as conduct household surveys, and I've also done a large field experiment on water governance in this area, some of the main themes that have come out of this are that rural community members perceive a strong impact of local politics. So I found in my research that active communities, especially through these community associations that I'll describe a bit more, can organize as a group and use their block vote to bargain with local politicians to convince them to fix the pump on the well and do maintenance on that desal plant and improve local water security. I also find in other projects that I won't be focusing on now, but I'm happy to talk about more in a Q&A, focused on common pool resource management. So I see in again, this other study that having enhanced community discussion about conservation tips and tools, having more social sanctions within the group against wasting water or overuse of water, and that enhanced monitoring of the status of the resource, for example, the level of water in the wells, can help to improve water conservation and management within communities. So in terms of the political story that I'll be focusing on now, the main argument in this work is that communities can organize through community associations, or in other countries, these might take different forms in terms of more organized water committees. And through these, especially if they overlap with polling stations, these communities can coordinate their vote, and they can say, okay, here we have 100 votes in this community, and if we give our vote and focus our vote in one particular city council member or mayoral candidate, again, depending on the local political environment, we can use that and bargain with the politician in between elections to convince them to fix that pump on the well, or prioritize us for community development or rural development programs. However, of course, this isn't possible everywhere. I didn't see this happening everywhere. And so a couple prominent sources of variation really stood out in my qualitative interviews in the state of Ceará, was the state where I was doing this research. And these were the degree of activity of community members in the local association, so whether they attended meetings and participated. Also the leadership of the community association. So the president of this association, was the president responsive to local members' demands? How organized were they in terms of actually seeking out politicians and making these demands? I also looked at the role of political endorsement. So in many cases, the community association and literature on other types of associations throughout Latin America has found this as well, that association leaders will ally or endorse specific local political candidates and build these ties. And I look at outcomes here of block voting. So to what extent do these communities then coordinate their votes in one particular candidate, as well as public service access. And in particular, in my project, I was really focusing on water. And so the question that I'm seeking to understand here is, how do citizens perceive the impact of community organizing on both political behavior, but also this access? And so again, I'm taking a look at Northeast Brazil. So this is a semi-arid region, quite different from the deforestation challenges in other parts of Brazil. There's no forest here. It's very, very dry, primarily subsistence farmers in the rural areas of the state where I was working. And this was a map that was drawn as part of a large field experiment through EGAP that I was running a couple of years ago. And so this was a community that was mapping out its water resources. So we can see here in the middle is the Associação. So this is the community association. It features prominently in how in governance for a number of different features within the community, but also is a really key player in water governance and management. And then each of these black squares was a house, and the dot next to it was a rainwater cistern. So this is an individualized rainwater cistern installed by the government as part of a co-production of public-private partnership that the government did that made a big difference for reducing water insecurity and in fact, reducing clientelism and other factors that other studies have pointed to. And these communities are relying on many different water resources. So poço as well. So they're relying on different wells, some of which have water and some of which don't. They're relying on a local river. They have a small water distribution system within the community, but many of them are going to a shared water source, the chafariz. In terms of local water management in this region, the state water company Coger monitors and governs the large reservoirs, rivers, and even wells that have very large output. But in these small communities with small output wells, there is no formal water governance. And this is legally, there is the community associations in this context are different from water committees in other parts of Latin America, in that these community associations do not have a formal water governance role. They have an informal one, and they also often oversee someone who's called a local operator, for example, the man who's standing here next to the well. So while there are a lot of features that they can govern within the community, they don't have the resources or the technical skills to dig a new well or purchase and install a new pump. So for those things, they do have to rely on the local government. And so in terms of local politics in this area, the city council member is the main link to the mayor. So in Brazil, voting is mandatory, and for city council, it's done through at-large, open-list proportional representation. So essentially what that means is that city council candidates can seek votes anywhere in the municipality. They're not limited to a specific spatial region. And so for a small rural community to have a voice in local politics, they really need to ally themselves with a specific city council member, because it's possible that the city council members that end up getting elected to the city council don't actually even cover their spatial area. And the electoral section, the polling station data is public. So community associations in this area are essential for accessing many government programs. They are required to exist on paper for access to many state programs and NGOs. But of course, there's going to be variation in community activity, social capital, and these different types of organizing happening at the local level. So that's the variation I really was interested in getting to know.
And Alicia, I'm just coming in to let you know we're at 10 minutes right now.
Okay, great. Sorry. So very, very quickly, in terms of, I oversaw a household survey and used a conjoint method with pictogram booklets to try to explore variation in some of these community features. And my main findings, I'll summarize them here, are that community participation in the association and a perception that the leader is responsive to community members play really important roles in perceived access to public services. And I see in other observational data that high trust and having the same leader over time can improve water security. and that this block voting mechanism does also help to improve water security. So lastly, in my work, I look both at this local political behavior and relationship and how it shapes water security at the local level, but also in other projects, I'm looking at how different community organizing features can shape governance and monitoring of, for especially scarce resources like groundwater, where in this area, wells have been known to dry up, and as droughts become more frequent and severe, this area is really going to be facing some pretty extreme water scarcity. And so understanding variation in community organizing and these community associations is important both for how we understand local politics in these areas, but also how we can try to design strategies to support communities that are doing these governance mechanisms so that they can have better water access and governance moving forward. So that is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and I hope that we can expand on your findings during the discussion. For the next presentation, we're staying actually in the northeast of Brazil, and Gustavo is going to present about Southern Bahia. Gustavo, I hope you're still with us. We can't hear you.
I cannot, yeah, there he is. You're muted, Gustavo.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, Zoom got hung up a little bit. Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the great presentation, Alicia. We're going to continue talking about sort of the politics of resource use in my talk, but in a shifting perspective a little bit more. Less of a quantitative approach and kind of a little bit more of an impressionistic approach to thinking about the politics of natural resource use. So the title of my talk is A Political Ecology of Brazil's Discovery Coast, Crisis, Socio-Environmental Hybridization, and Historical Amnesia in the Frontiers of Global Liberalism. And so what I am going to talk to you about today is just kind of give you a brief story of the sort of historical political ecology of the region of the Discovery Coast as part of Southern Bahia. The origin of this paper is an attempt to sort of distill some key ideas from a book-length project that looks at the history of the region. This particular paper is for a special volume dedicated to the work of Eric Wolf. So for those of you that had a chance to read it, that's why there was a heavy emphasis on Eric Wolf and kind of his take on historical materialism and so that's a kind of a strong influence in the approach that I'm taking here. So the Discovery Coast, this is where it's part of Southern Bahia. It's where Brazil was first discovered by the Portuguese, first landfall. One of the first places colonized in Brazil. The origin of this is, so it started out as sort of primarily an ethnographic project working with Pataxó community, indigenous communities in this region, which is one of the most forested and regions of coastal Brazil and one of the few places where there's still kind of an indigenous presence. And so what was really struck me about the communities that I worked in was just the sort of complex and dynamic hybridity of resource use, both like the seasonal dynamism, the vast.
Gustavo, there's no presentation. You're sharing screen, but it's like a black thing.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Try that again.
Still black.
Still black. Oy. Shoot. That is unfortunate.
Can you present without the presentation?
Yes, I guess I can. I don't really have another choice. That's odd.
Do you want to switch the order of the two speakers? And your here it is.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, great. Okay.
It emerged.
All right. So yeah, so I was struck by the sort of wide range of different economic activities that community members engage in, the wide variety of different activities in different communities and different households, how that changes over time. You know, people engage in agriculture, extractive activities, they work in labor markets, they do daily wage labor. So I was really interested in this question. And here's just a map that shows some of the communities, and they live in a wide range of different kinds of habitats, more forested habitats, coastal areas, and there's a lot of movement and circulation of people between these communities from year to year, seasonally. Which struck me is that this wasn't necessarily unique to this community. This is kind of true of rural communities more generally. So I'm really kind of interested in this sort of idea of the sort of hybrid strategies of economic and environmental resilience. And this is both the dynamic heterogeneity at individual household and community levels, but also just hybridity in the sense of the cultural and economic synthetic strategies that involve, you know, African influences, indigenous influences, and European influences. But I'm also interested in this issue of the sort of the contradictory and selective valuation of indigenous labor, expertise, and creative agency, you know, within development projects, within land struggles. You know, there you see this kind of persistent exclusion of indigenous peoples and the rural poor, despite this kind of turn towards a kind of more inclusive discourse about indigenous peoples and their expertise and their agency in both the literature and in sort of a development context. And both these struck me as important in the contemporary moment, but that these have kind of a longer historical you know, story. So what I attempt to do is sort of develop a historical political ecology of the Discoveries Coast, and do it through sort of a synthetic lens that looks at both economic development, labor dynamics, and land and resource use policies as a part of one kind of combined process. And in this historical approach, things that I tried to kind of focus on is kind of the idea of sort of crisis and social change. So how sort of moments of crisis kind of bring social change, but also there's continuity. This idea of social environmental hybridity that I referred to, where, you know, you have ongoing processes of sort of unification and differentiation as different cultural groups come into contact with one another, right? So you're sort of defining a sort of common humanity, but also at the same time making distinctions between different social groups. And this idea of historical amnesia, by which I mean sort of a selective reading of history, but also the historical amnesia more in the sense of Eric Wolf's work, this idea that there's this people without history, right? That non-Europeans kind of lack tradition and lack historical agency. So kind of wanted to tend to these sorts of things. So I mean, the approach I take is very much a sort of a historical materialist approach, rooted in some of the work that Wolf does, but also kind of I take up the sort of concept of fetishism, as sort of a kind of a revised idea of fetishism, of Marxian fetishism, to sort of look at these questions. I'm not going to get into the theoretical piece. I just want to kind of tell the empirical story, but just to give you a sense of the reasons for why I'm approaching it in this way. So my history of the region focuses on kind of three pivotal moments. So it's sort of three kind of moments of crisis, if you will. So the early colonial period is the first period, you know, where European presence first shows up. The late colonial Brazil, where there's a radical kind of transformation in both environmental and indigenous policies in this part of Brazil. And then the Anthropocene is where we have this kind of major change in terms of deforestation in the region. So in the early colonial period, you have an early attempt to sort of create sugarcane plantations using indigenous labor. And you have indigenous labor being used for the extraction of Brazil wood, which is an important dye, source of dye for European trade. And what happens is the sugarcane plantations fail because of the epidemic crisis. And it's at this point in time where sugarcane production becomes important for Brazil, but it's where you start seeing, because of the epidemic collapse, you see the importation of African slaves. And so what happens is there's kind of a social, environmental, and spatial differentiation between the plantation system centered in Salvador de Bahia to the north, and this region becomes more of an extractive area for primarily Brazil wood, but for timber and other things through a Jesuit missionary system. And so this region remains a sort of kind of underdeveloped area, kind of more natural, a lot of extractive activities, and not so important for, for the economy of Portugal and Brazil. Towards the late colonial period, you have this fairly radical change. There's the Lisbon earthquake, and that precipitates a bunch of changes to Portuguese political system, this sort of process of modernization, where there's a push to rebuild Lisbon, to expand fleet, to modernize educational system, and all of that leads to this push to develop Brazil, like underdeveloped areas of Brazil further, to more strongly assimilate indigenous peoples. There's a strong demand for timber, and this region of Southern Bahia becomes really important for that. So what you have is this attempt to radically transform the region, and that includes, enslaving indigenous peoples, exterminating them, and moving them towards supporting the sort of timber economy and the production of food. And so there's this radical transformation, and there is sort of deforestation and stuff, but really deforestation and sort of the economic development of the region doesn't really take hold until the mid 1900s. And here you see a map of forest cover, and you see this is a period of time when there's a road being built that connects Salvador to Rio, and there's this in a very short period of time like a rapid destruction of the area and transformation from forested areas to pasture land and plantations. And what you have these days is a region that is, still has some sort of primary forest cover, but has really been transformed into, planted eucalyptus plantations and tourism. Those are kind of the main vocations of the region. And so within that context, return to the issue of the Pataxó communities. So they're inhabit this area where there are strong tensions with, the eucalyptus plantation economy, pressures from real estate speculation, and from the tourism industry. And you also have tensions with conservation as well. A bunch of the communities are sort of in or surrounding a national park, one of the first national parks in Brazil. And so there's been an ongoing political battle over this park. In 1999, the Pataxó kind of took over the park and took it out of the hands of National Park Service. Eventually, they came to a sort of agreement for co-management. And so in recent decades, what you have is this kind of push towards sustainable development, with a lot of different projects focused on climate change, conservation, involving these communities. And there's a sort of this kind of participatory approach to conservation, but there's also a lot of tensions, right, between economic experts, environmental experts, and indigenous communities in terms of like how they define environmental goals, what the priorities are, how they define risks. And so I'm really interested in how this kind of continued struggle to kind of define nature and to secure access to nature is informed by some of these kind of historical notions of difference and exclusion, and how that sort of persists to today. So I'm not going to get into all of this. I know my time is short, but one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize as I engage in this historical analysis is focusing on continuities. I think a lot of times we tend to think of the exceptionality of the present moment, right? I think some of the language of sort of like how we think about neoliberalism, how we think about the Anthropocene, how we think about, the inclusion of indigenous peoples. We tend to think of recent times as being sort of exceptional in both positive and negative ways. And I think sometimes we often kind of overstate those kind of discontinuities and sort of novelties in a way that I think disguises some important continuities, and I think that help us to understand the origins, the dynamics, the history of the current social, economic, and environmental problems that we have. So just my sort of closing observation, just to say that, you know, the sort of historical approach that I am attempting here with this sort of emphasis on dynamic hybridity, you know, I think helped us kind of reevaluate the historical contributions and agency of marginalized people. I think that that's kind of one goal that I want to do, is to sort of look at, you know, the political, environmental, and social agency of Indigenous people throughout this history. But I also want to sort of complicate the ways in which we characterize the origins, dynamics, and workings of neoliberalism. I think we often, you know, especially sort of left-leaning scholarship tends to, I think, simplify neoliberalism and sort of create these ideas of neoliberalism as something kind of separate and apart from subsistence economies, and right, the boundaries between formality and informality and different sort of economic models is much more complicated than what I think that sort of narrative allows. So, you know, the goal here is again to sort of encourage novel ways of recognizing and highlighting, interpreting the emergent moment, and sort of thinking about, you know, whether we're talking about the climate crisis or a crisis of sort of precarity in labor that we talk about, to sort of talk about those kinds of issues with more nuance. So I will stop there. Sorry if I ran over. It's a complicated story to tell, hard to pack into 10 minutes. But I think, yeah, I think some of the stuff I'm talking in a very sort of abstract and impressionistic way, but I think some of the things I talk about sort of touch upon things that Alicia's work does and Marcos's work does as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, Gustavo. And you said exactly what I was going to say, which is that you're all fairly interconnected. So we're going to move on to Marcos Mendoza, who is going to talk about green distributive politics and the narco environment in Michoacán, actually. So Marcos, go ahead.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, well, so today, in terms of thinking about regional transformations in nature and society, I'd like to focus on two key dynamics: green development and the narco environments, and examining how these intersect within a case study from Western Mexico, from the state of Michoacán, that focuses on creating pine resin plantations, on resin harvesting, on combating deforestation, and that is situated within a regional context of organized crime. I would define the narco environment as the interface between narco trafficking and socio-environmental worlds impacted by drug cultivation and transit. So narco capital, of course, operates within illicit domains, but it also spills across into the legal economy as well. So it's focused on cultivation and transit zones. It will also, through criminal organizations, be linked to practices of extortion, of kidnapping, of resource pillaging. And then money laundering practices by organized crime groups are going to be filtered into legal ventures like cattle ranching, palm oil plantations, real estate, and many others. And of course, scholars draw attention to how this is tied up with land grabs, dispossession, and violence. But of course, the narco environment is also itself structured by the war on drugs, which has a series of key pillars, right? So we have drug eradication efforts, aerial spraying campaigns, manual removal campaigns. We have crop substitution programs, right, that are trying to incentivize drug cultivators to go into, producing legal commodities. U.S. military basing agreements, both formal and informal, which underpins surveillance efforts and interdiction efforts, right, between partner countries, between the United States and allied countries in Latin America. As various scholars have noted, the war on drugs has essentially produced a situation in which narco capital is an extremely flexible, spatially speaking actor that can move into different regions, that can move across boundaries. And then in turn, when it reaches new areas, facilitate deforestation, facilitate land grabs, and more violence. Now, on the opposite side, we've got green development. And of course, this takes a wide variety of forms in Latin America, from sustainable forestry to renewable energy, to ecotourism, to climate finance. And at least in this paper, I'd like to consider this very briefly through the context of what I call green distributive politics. So thinking about how some types of green development involve value transfers from state or capital actors to marginalized rural communities. And through these value transfers, seek to build socio-political relationships that convert rural citizens into citizen subjects that are charged to have environmental responsibilities for the protection of these resources. So focusing on how value transfers facilitate are linked to legitimation and consent building dynamics. Now to kind of think about the intersection between the narco environment on the one hand and green development on the other, I enlist the concept of risk capital. So in the world of finance, risk capital refers to investments in highly speculative activities that contain significant degrees of uncertainty. You might imagine, venture capital, for example, is associated with risk capital. So the question is, to what extent are green development actors that are working in precarious environments throughout the region enlisting, whether intentionally or unintentionally, a concept of risk capital to kind of manage their assets? Thinking specifically about this case, how is the risk capital of these pine resin plantations being configured is what I'm going to try and work out. So the case study focuses on a green social enterprise called Ejido Verde that operates within Michoacan, that is working to create pine plantations that will generate marketable resin that will then be sold to the pine chemical industry in Michoacan itself. The project is designed to promote rural livelihoods, to tackle the problem of deforestation. And the target for Ejido Verde is essentially within Michoacan to replant 12,000 hectares of forest. But as Cho et al. From 2021 notes, over the last 20 years, Michoacan has suffered approximately 85,000 hectares of forest loss. So it makes a dent, but it's not, it's not going to completely solve the problem. The study location for this is in northeastern Michoacan, and particularly focused on a valley called the Ucareo Valley, which is located in the municipio of Sinapecuaro. In this area, the kind of most recent history of the narco environment prior to 2014 pertains to two primary cartel groups, La Familia Michoacana and Los Caballeros Templarios. I could talk about their activities later on if you'd like me to, but basically they're engaging in deforestation in the municipio in addition into other regions of the state. After they were ejected from this area, in the last few years, new actors have moved into the zone and deforestation has resumed. So in thinking about Ejido Verde, how, given the risks of the narco environment that exists within the Ucareo Valley, how are they attracting green finance? Well, they're turning to public sources of funding. So they're looking at CONAFOR, which is the Mexican Forestry Commission, and CONAFOR has contributed public subsidies to lower the costs of the project. They're also, focusing on private finance, and in particular targeting the Kiva micro-lending platform. So, for example, you can see one of the profiles that Kiva, develops to attract people who are going to give money to certain groups associated with this project. And through these Kiva digital profiles, you can see how how Kiva and Ejido Verde are working to calibrate the risk capital associated with the project. What are they doing? Are they eliminating all the risks, from these donor narratives? No, they're not. In fact, they're amplifying what I would call the soft risks of deforestation and climate change. But they're also entirely denying that the narco environment exists. So there's no discussion of organized crime. There's no discussion of narco violence or any of that, right? Instead, what they're doing is they're amplifying the soft risks of deforestation, but without any kind of structural explanation for why this is going on, in order to convert smallholders into creditworthy recipients for solidarity lending. And it's been very successful for Ejido Verde. Okay, so if they're attracting funding from these sources, they also need to recruit smallholder participants. So how do they convince smallholders to actually participate in this program, given local concerns about land grabs, about debt, and about corporate power. While they're essentially offering very generous loan conditions, 0% interest, no repayment for 10 to 12 years until the trees reach maturity and begin to produce resin. And then there's repayment staggered across 10 years that is denominated not in cash, but in resin volumes. So that for each hectare under cultivation, the smallholders will pay back, I think it's 350 kilos of resin to the Ejido Verde. There's also a conditionality clause attached to the contracts, which says that there's only repayment if and when there is resin. Now that's pretty ambiguous, but basically the way that smallholders interpret this is that if there's resin, there will be repayment. If there's no resin, then there will be no repayment. And what this conditionality clause does is it factors in the narco environment. It allows for the possibility that there might be massive deforestation or illegal logging, which leads to kind of the decimation of a forest that ultimately doesn't produce resin. And so the smallholders are not on the hook in terms of debt for paying back Ejido Verde. So the company is essentially trying to factor in the possibilities of catastrophic forest loss into these contracts as a way to get buy-in, to get participants to come on board. Now, in addition to this, right, they're also, this is a very long-term project that's going to play out across at least 2 decades. And they're also working to create what I would call eco-political subjects. They're trying to, build these long-term relationships between the company and the smallholders that will endure over decades. First of all, they're hiring local forestry crews. So in every area where they work, they're hiring locals who are going to create the pine plantations. In the case of Ucareo Valley, they hired 60 local men who are going to participate in terms of demarcating the territory, fencing it off, planting the trees, and then engaging in the routine maintenance work associated with maintaining the plantations. And these forestry crews are working with the smallholders and attempting to convert them into resineros, into resin tappers, essentially by teaching them forest care techniques and quietly shifting control or protection over the forests onto their shoulders. Now, how are they actually going to deal with this situation? Well, there's a couple options available to them. First of all, they could hire local local people to kind of act as a private security force to protect their forests at night, especially. This is, of course, a costly, possibility, so unlikely to happen, but although it could. Another situation is that the resineros themselves create their own forest guard, basically create mutual aid networks that will take turns rotating through people who would then stand guard over the forests. But of course, this is an unresolved issue, and there's no real kind of central direction that this is taking, at least right now. And it will develop over many years, given the fact that the trees aren't really going to reach maturity until about 10 to 12 years from now. So what are the implications of this for our talk, our conference, in thinking through the regional transformations of nature and society? Well, I've talked very briefly about 2 key dynamics: green development and the narco environment. Typically, these are viewed as fundamentally antagonistic, right? Typically, we assume that green development actors are going to avoid at all costs narco environments. What's really fascinating about this case is that we have a situation where a green development actor is engaging directly the perils of the narco environments. And what they're doing is they're developing investment risk discourses. They're calibrating the investment risk associated with the project for different audiences. They're completely erasing them altogether from the perspective of the micro lenders, and they're trying to deal with them and factor them into the contract terms for the smallholders in order to build these green distributive networks of value transfer from micro creditors in the global north primarily, all the way down to smallholders in Michoacan who are participating in the project. And doing so while covertly creating eco-political subjects to guard these investments into the foreseeable future. So as scholars, I would suggest we just remain attentive to how green development and green finance might use this logic of risk capital to structure investments within precarious environments. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos. I'm going to just very briefly talk about what I see as the bridges between these papers, and then we'll just open it up to questions and discussion. So these 3 papers not only consider different dimensions of what we might think of as livelihood and access, but use very different methodologies to answer these questions about participation in politics, development, cultural and economic life. I think that at play here are different definitions of community and community relations to politics, environment, and economy. And I think that that's something really interesting to consider. As I listened, I wondered in what ways these projects might speak to one another, and perhaps once we consider questions specific to each project, we can transition to some of the broader questions I'm going to bring up here. So here are my questions. What does Alicia's perspective on collective action through community organizing and block voting contribute to recognizing the historical challenges, political and land-based, faced by the Pataxó communities in Bahia? How does this relate to Gustavo's reference in his paper to Susanna Hecht's insurgent citizenship? And I think that Susanna is with us, actually. How is this same notion of collective action relevant to considering green development in a narco-environmental context? What do the processes of consent building and legitimation that Marcos describes as part of the Ejido Verde initiative and its partnership with Kiva play into a long-term vision of environmental sustainability in Michoacán? And then returning to Alicia's idea of a trade that is happening between citizens and politicians through community organizations, what other kinds of trade are taking place in each one of these cases? And here I'm referring to financial trade, cultural trade, labor, and material trade. What role does fetishism play, both for the human and non-human agents described in these case studies? And here I'm referring to Gustavo's discussion of fetishism. How does the violence experienced historically by the Pataxó inform a sort of partial consciousness, which is very clearly apparent in the ways in which Ejido Verde presents itself to potential investors, right? So some things are absolutely at the forefront and others are veiled. And how does the work of both Gustavo and Marcos push on the boundaries of the political dynamics that Alicia describes? So I will leave it there. I hope this is instigating. We have a first question actually for Alicia. I'm trying to see it here on my screen, from Jacob Copas, who says, great presentation. Seems like your theory explains local provision of capital infrastructure investments quite well, which raises two questions. Number one, will this interaction over time lead to greater development overall in a municipality, considering there are only so many wells or desalination plants you can build in one village? And number two, how does your theory apply to other common pool resources that might not require capital investments? For example, conserving forests. So you can go ahead, Alicia, and then others can raise their hands or write into the chat, whatever works best for you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jacob. So yeah, in terms of the first question, on the one hand, yes, especially if communities can learn from each other. That said, collective action is pretty sticky and hard to change over time. We know it's hard to instigate to begin with. And so, you know, kind of on the other hand, I would say no. I'm focusing more in my project on maintenance of existing investments as opposed to new investments. And so a challenge there is that these well-organized communities are going to continue needing maintenance over time, which could in fact push out maintenance of the less organized communities. So in that sense, it could actually just lead to enhanced inequality between communities within the same municipality because of this maintenance issue. I saw in a field experiment also with an externally facilitated water governance program that in general, our program failed. And the main reason that it failed is that we had very low uptake of the project in communities that were less organized. So the communities that did engage with the groundwater monitoring were the ones that already met regularly, that already had an active constant leader, that already had an operator monitoring their water resources, which was probably associated with them already having an association. So in this sense, the better organized places continue to leverage new resources, continue to engage with new NGO projects, whereas the ones that aren't organized, it's hard to spur that. And so in a sense, this almost speaks to the historical features of the region, that some, trying to understand like, why is it that some areas had more collective action than others? And people often pointed to just the history of the region, that some communities had really gotten mobilized by land reform movements or the MST or other kind of Catholic Church movements during the military dictatorship, or even deeper historical relationships between small-scale tenants and the fazendeiros and the large-scale fazendas in the region. So that's where it speaks in a sense to how these deep histories and relationships between tenant farmers and landowners then affect community organizing and mobilizing in this new political economy. And then on that last question, in a sense, this speaks to Marcos's work. So in thinking about community-based forest management, there's less of this issue of maintenance of public resources, right? But there are still external programs or private finance or other public resources, ecological fiscal transfers, for example, that a more organized, mobilized community that already knows how to navigate the bureaucracy is going to be better positioned to leverage, take advantage of, adopt these resources and new programs. And so they might be better positioned to meet the criteria, especially often, these external programs are going to want to see community-driven development. And so having an active association that already meets regularly is going to be something that might be even in the program, or something that Kiva would highlight on their website. This association has already existed for 15 years, so your loan is more likely to be successful. And so they're better able to navigate these things. So in a sense, I'm grateful to Jacob's question, because it actually kind of helped me speak to both of the other really interesting papers on this panel.
Great. We have a question from Isabella.
Hi, I really enjoyed all three papers, and but my question is for Marcos, I should say. Marcos, I do some work on citizens' expectations of the role of the state as an insurer in cases of natural disaster. And so I see this this area of research as incredibly important and probably becoming bigger and bigger. These expectations of the type of insurance and who should provide it, whether the private insurers or the state in climate change and and increased environmental degradation. And so I feel that your research speaks to that, to whether it should be a division of labor or so. Have you? I don't know if you have any thoughts on what your research says about whether we should expect more of a state role in insurance with these risks that are acts of God and then structural violence, or more of a role for the private sector?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So a few points of fact. So first of all, the Ucara Valley is an area in which farmers typically don't have access to farming insurance. As a consequence, they're fundamentally exposed to a lot of hailstorms that transpire in the high mountains of Michoacan, and they have to factor that into kind of basically how they survive over the long term. In terms of the state, the role of the state in this. What I see the state doing, at least in the case that I'm working on, is the state through CONAFOR has these payments for ecosystem services programs. So paying people to conserve the land, to protect the forests. But CONAFOR and the state wants to move people off of these direct payments and into market activities. Right, so they're willing to subsidize projects like Ejido Verde that will facilitate these transitions from communities that are, receiving PES payments to programs or to communities that will develop these agroforestry projects that will produce resin, for example, for the pine chemical industry, and do so in a way that is consistent with the broader aims of the Mexican government and its neoliberal implications of increasing productivity in the ejidos and in the comunidades agrarias, right? So, if the government's not going to privatize the ejidos, it's not going to privatize the comunidades agrarias, then then instead of that, there's the effort on the part of the governments over generations, over a generation at least, to attempt to raise productivity in the ejidos. And this is one particular way they can do that, is through these green development programs, right? That take advantage of the fact that they're going to offer these amazing deals, right? I mean, 0 interest loans and you don't have to pay them back for 10 years, right? To do this. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting kind of set of intersections between the lack of insurance, right, at a kind of private level for these farmers, the efforts of the state to kind of create subsidies that funnel to these communities through PES programs, and then these green development initiatives, which are pushing communities in the way of the market that will develop these sustainable products.
Thanks, Marcos. We are running out of time and losing participants, but I think we can go on for a few minutes. And I want to give Gustavo a chance to talk a little bit. A question just came in for him, but also Vicky was asking for people to respond to my multiple questions. So Gustavo, I guess you can start wherever you want, but the question specifically for you has to do with indigenous resistance in the area of political relations of the Pataxó with other indigenous groups in the region.
I guess I can kind of comment on that question and also Vicky's provocation to talk about the role of the state. So, I think the way I see it is the role of the state is not quite absent in this area. It's more of like a fickle presence, and it has always been so. Even stretching back to colonial times, right? There has always been a sort of official presence, but it has been unreliable and sort of there's a big disjunct between like policies and actual practices. What has happened just in the last several decades in terms of like indigenous affairs. It used to be the relationship was entirely with the Federal Indigenous Affairs Institute, FUNAI, which historically was good in some ways because it had one point of connection between communities and the government, but it also created some very problematic sort of clientelistic relationships in a lot of indigenous communities. And what has happened is there's been and we can see this as a sort of, a precipitate of neoliberalism. There's been a sort of a change in the relationship between indigenous communities and the government, so that things like health, education now don't all come through the Indigenous Affairs Office. There's a much more complex relationship with political institutions at the federal, state, and local level. And that change has been, it's been a difficult transition, but has both good and negative aspects to it. It's created a sort of diversified relationships with government entities, which makes it more complicated to navigate those in some ways, but has also, I think, introduced a little bit more of like resilience to political agency of these communities because they're not so dependent on sort of one particular source of power. And so, in parallel with that, there's also been greater and greater organizing between Pataxó communities, so creating communities, creating organizations that connect all these different communities. But also, there's a lot of mobilization at the level of other indigenous communities in Southern Bahia, and also indigenous communities within the northeast of Brazil, and also at the national level. But particularly in the northeast of Brazil, there's been a sort of a critical mass of organization around issues, and the northeast Brazil has its particularly unique indigenous struggles, right? It's not the same as the Amazon for environmental reasons, but also for social and historical reasons. These are communities that are sort of often viewed as sort of re-emergent ethnicities. You know, some of them have lost their languages. They're sort of more mestizo communities. So that there's particular struggles that they deal with that are different than Amazonian Indians. And, you know, particularly this question of authenticity is a big one. And which is part of the reason why I put a lot of attention on this issue of like hybridity, because it is something that's really very evident and visible in these communities. But I think it's actually true of all indigenous communities and rural communities more generally, but it's particularly important for the Northeast.
Thanks, Gustavo. I don't know what the limitations are with time. Maybe Vicky, you can let us know.
Yeah, I think we have to finish now. We will meet again next Friday at 1 p.m. We have a panel called Sensing and Recreating Nature, and with Ronald Gregg, Alex Albert, Rona Maria Ochoa, and Els Lagro. And I think that's the third panel of this conference. And I look forward to seeing you all, and all of you who are in the YouTube as well. You're welcome to come, and we will be continuing all Fridays for a while. Thanks to everyone who came. I think this has been an incredibly rich conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in the next iterations of the conference.
Thank you.
Bye.